About an hour ago, we had conversation with the United States team about possible security guarantees for Ukraine, and we are working on a framework document, and it must be strong enough to truly work. And one more point, we are ready to work with President Trump in any format, and if President Trump is speaking more about elections in Ukraine, I want to say this very openly. We can try to hold elections. Ukraine is not hiding from democracy, but to make elections possible, there must be a security component, and America can help with this the most. If there is a need for elections now, there must be a ceasefire at least during election process and during voting, and this is something that must be discussed. And honestly, we think here in Ukraine that America should speak to the Russian side about this.
For the first time in months, President Volodymyr Zelensky is openly discussing elections. Moscow immediately dismissed the move, calling it a political tactic aimed at securing a temporary ceasefire and buying time for Ukraine's exhausted military. Russian officials argue that a legal vote inside Ukraine is risky for Zelensky under current wartime conditions and claim he is turning instead to what they call an external election model shaped around Western-backed diaspora voting.
Zelensky clearly wants to remain in power, there is no doubt about that, but at the same time, no one doubts that he has no chance of being legally re-elected.
The Russian Foreign Ministry alleges that Kyiv is asking Europe and the United States to effectively guarantee the outcome, from securing polling stations abroad to adjusting Ukrainian law under martial measures and supervising the vote. Moscow compares the plan to Moldova's diaspora-driven elections and says the West is preparing a similar scenario for Ukraine.
Zelensky's demands of the West are clear. Here it is: elections that do not align with the universal understanding. He does not need elections in Ukraine. What he needs are elections for himself.
Zelensky has also linked any future election to a nationwide ceasefire, insisting that voting cannot take place under constant bombardment. Russia says this reveals Kyiv's military reality, arguing that a pause in fighting would give Ukraine breathing space to regroup amid battlefield losses.
He, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, may simply view this as an opportunity to achieve a temporary ceasefire, and that's all.
At the same time, Zelensky is urging the United States to approve a legally binding security framework to make elections viable. He wants Congress to back a 20-point guarantees package and says no electoral process can move forward without coordinated support from the U.S., Europe, and allied partners.
We believe this document should be approved by the United States Congress. This would mean real, solid, legally binding security guarantees for our country, and they must actually be implemented. Of course, a working model of security guarantees is impossible, and we underlined it, impossible without Europe and all members of our coalition of the willing, from Canada to Japan, Australia, and New Zealand. Thank you all. And now we need to coordinate everything so that the Americans are fully on board in every process.
But pressure on Zelensky is now building in Washington as well. President Donald Trump revealed he had pretty strong words with European leaders during a call on Ukraine, and publicly questioned why Kyiv has gone so long without elections. Trump urged Zelensky to be realistic, tying Ukraine's political timetable to the wider demands for a negotiated end to the war.
The leaders of France, we spoke to, and Germany, and UK, all very good leaders, very good friends of mine, and we discussed Ukraine in pretty strong words, and we'll see what happens. I think he has to be realistic, and I do wonder about, how long is it going to be till they have an election? It's a democracy. It's a long time.
Trump's comments come as Europe also raises hard questions. Luxembourg recently acknowledged that while Europe is supplying weapons, young Ukrainians continue fleeing conscription. A contradiction Moscow has seized on to argue Kyiv is preparing to combine elections with forced mobilization.
As the draft age is lowered, more and more young people are fleeing Ukraine. Luxembourg's Minister of the Interior, Leon Glodin, said, "Humanly speaking, I can understand that. However, there is a sense of strangeness, because on the one hand, we are sending weapons and money to Ukraine so that it can defend itself, and on the other hand, people are fleeing from there. We need to decide on one or the other, because we can't have both." Twofer. In other words, it is gradually becoming clear, albeit at different speeds, that the weapons and money they are supplying to the Kyiv regime are not quite reaching their destination. And the people whom Zelensky uses as a cover when he demands money and weapons from the West are not particularly eager to fight. And that the only way to connect the weapons received with these very people is to forcibly mobilize them in Ukraine.
For Moscow, Zelensky's election initiative reflects a collapsing battlefield position and a bid for political survival. For Trump and several European leaders, it raises broader questions about accountability, timelines, and Ukraine's long-delayed democratic process. As the war grinds on, Ukraine's election debate has now become a geopolitical fault line, shaped by Kremlin accusations, Washington pressure, and Europe's growing concerns over the future of the conflict.